interesting to hear her insights on what could be called the relationship between business and human rights, and this was also related to what Lucia said. And finally, thank you also, Elissa, for sharing us your personal experience, which could be very, I don't know, exemplifying for some of the law students here. I would like to begin this short conversation because we don't have much time. Thank you again for Google, because students and anybody who has a question, I guess, could Google your names and find your emails and then bombard you with many questions. But since I'm the moderator, I have control, and I'm going to ask a few questions, a little bit more broadly. What could be the role of civil society and NGOs in addressing environmental inequality? And do lawyers have a particular role on this? I don't know who would like to begin, perhaps Hana?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak on that briefly. So my organization, the Center for International Environmental Law, we've been around, I think, probably about 30 years. And one of the things that we do, that we specialize in, is actually doing advocacy to UN, to committees that have been, committees of member states that have been convened on special topics. So, for example, on human rights. And one of the, last year in June, we were very much one of the kind of key advocates to have established a right to a healthy and sustainable, to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This was groundbreaking. It was really the kind of first clear recognition that there is this intersection between environment and human rights. I think also last year in October, you should definitely look at a report that was adopted by the UN General Assembly, written by the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. It's a great report. Again, these are things that we have also contributed, both kind of case studies, but also kind of elaboration of what kind of laws pertain to this subject matter. And I'll just note that I have also been involved in, for example, addressing land rights issues in land grabbing in Brazil by U.S. pension funds, and advising pensioners in the U.S. what rights they have to try to get their pension fund manager to stop, committing these egregious acts, or trying to stop a pipeline in Uganda that is, as we speak, attacking human rights defenders for trying to defend their land from being, violated by these pipelines and potential, very likely, oil spills. And so, there's a number of ways. I mean, I think the role of the lawyer is really to inform, as the previous panel said, a lot of these communities who are affected do not know what their rights are, right? They don't know what they don't know. And so, really enabling that and empowering them, that is a huge role that lawyers can play.
So just a couple of other things I'd add to things that the private sector, NGOs, and civil society might be able to accomplish in many ways better than governments. I think they are very well suited for getting local knowledge on the ground, particularly when it's working with indigenous populations or knowing something that is unique to a particular area. I think sometimes there's a distance between government and individuals, and sometimes NGOs and private organizations can fill that void and be a first point of contact for people who might not easily approach government. I think secondly, these organizations have an important role to play in education. And so certainly lawyers have a role in educating people about their rights, but also educating people about harms. There are a lot of things that somebody might not know. If there is a new facility being brought into town, what information will be shared with people? What's going to be shared is this is going to bring you jobs, this is going to bring you opportunities, this is going to economically develop the area. Well, there's a role for education to say, yes, it might bring all those things, but it's going to bring these other things as well. And so I think sometimes the private sector can do a better job in some of those organizations bringing about that information. I think there's a role of religious organizations, and we've seen that develop more in recent years, but even if you think back to our keynote, the important role of the United Church of Christ in that initial report that they did in 1982, and the importance of bringing that to people's attention. And then finally, I think that some of the NGOs and civil society groups can work with those who are concerned about issues that might not seem to be related. So, for example, some NGOs who are concerned about children, the role of education that they may have. Some of the groups interested in issues pertaining to women. If there is lack of access to safe water, who is it that goes and walks for hours a day to get water out of a clean well? Very often it is women and girls. And so working with those groups to see how they can help that make sure that water supply is cleaner. And another issue is some of the environmental reasons for immigration and migration. And some of that advocacy group work has been done by some of the private sector, NGO, and civil societies.
I would also like to add in terms of NGOs, capacity building, so ensuring that policymakers provide adequate laws and policies that enhance public participation, access to justice, and also provide transparency in terms of like information sharing. Also, to the point that Lucia made regarding education, raising awareness, mainstreaming issues, building evidence base of what are the issues and also what are the solutions being proposed is also important.
Thank you very much. Well, the first case of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is the court that I study mostly, the first case where the court considered that there was a right to access of information was a case where some individuals asked that information to a forest logging company. So it seems to be a relation there between access to information and the right to an environment, access to justice and the right to an adequate environment, and also perhaps the participation of communities. What's your take on this matter?
I can start with that question. So access to information, access to justice, and access to public participation on environmental decision making are very, very important for strong environmental governance. So I'm going to explain it the way that I explain it myself to understand these topics. So granting the access to information on environmental matters ensures transparency, meaning governments are called to let the public know the decisions that they have made or in the process of making, for example, environmental permits, concessions, and particularly ensure that the people directly being impacted by them know about what's happening, and how communities can effectively participate in those decision-making processes related to the natural resources they depend on. For example, the fish that they consume, the water that they drink, if they're not aware of the actions that are happening by the government, actions taken by the government or by private actors that could have great impacts on their natural resources. In order to effectively participate in environmental decision-making processes, communities need to understand the process, what is happening, what is at stake. That's why access to information regarding environmental matters is so important. And access to public participation, it's not just about granting a seat at the table. It's not just about, here is your seat, listen to what we have to say, and that's it. It's about ensuring equality. It's about ensuring that all voices are heard, no matter how big or how small, but they are heard and taken into consideration when making a decision. And also, how can communities or can anybody obtain relief where there has been a damage suffered because the water was polluted or the food was polluted or the air that they breathe is polluted, if they don't have access to justice, adequate access to the mechanisms to seek redress? Communities have a right to accessible, prompt, and adequate relief for the damages they suffer. So since all rights are indivisible, are very interrelated, these process or access rights are very crucial to the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment.
So I don't have too much to add, but just a couple of things about the access to information. Defending the defenders had been raised, and I think that is probably one of the most critical considerations, is making sure that those people who raise environmental concerns are protected. And we've spoken a lot about the importance of the advocacy, and I think here I don't worry about dangers to my personal safety in being an environmental advocate. I don't think that's something that crosses my mind too often. I don't worry that anything I write is going to lead to that result. That's not the case everywhere. And so defending the rights of people who advocate in writing or publicly, pointing out corruption, that can be a very dangerous and deadly business. And so if we want people to have access to that information, we also have to make sure that people who are providing that information are legally protected from harm. Second, I think the importance of the environmental impact statement, and domestically we see that in NEPA before there's a major federal activity with a significant impact on the human environment. The agency responsible has to prepare an environmental impact statement. And that certainly has made its way into international law. And I think that's critically important, but making sure that those reports are done honestly, that people aren't paid to have those reports come out a certain way, that they consider all reasonable alternatives, including doing nothing. And in particular, that they focus on the impact on future generations. And one of the things that's particularly difficult about protecting future generations are all the questions about who has standing to represent them in court. And we talk a lot about those issues, but before things happen, what are the requirements in an environmental impact statement to think about impacts on people in the future? And I think that's important information. And then finally, ensuring that there is a system of getting justice when there is a harm that has happened that is not corrupt, that is relatively timely, and that people have easy access to that when harms do happen.
Okay, so now we have only 10 minutes, unfortunately, for a Q&A section. I don't know if somebody would like to ask something. If not, I have plenty of other questions in my mind, so I don't want to be, selfish. Please.
I feel like the sea, there's so much part of like the oceans that are internationally kind of obscure who owns it, and I feel like there's been a lot more whaling and kind of stuff like that that's attacking a lot of people's perceptions, and they want it to be stopped. So kind of how does international like environmental law, like human rights, kind of intersect with when there's questions about who's like a responsible party, and like who are you trying to interact with, like at times when it's kind of questionable who's involved.
Would any of you like to answer? Say something?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think oftentimes it is like you can attribute it to, so, you know, for example, in the seas, there's illegal fishing that is quite, you know, a big problem, not only because of, you know, affecting the fish supply, but also because oftentimes it's linked with slavery, like working conditions, and you know, there's I think a lot of corruption involved in that as well. But you know, there are these ships are flying with flags associated with certain with countries that have, you know, permitted essentially those activities to be conducted under their flag. You know, the entities that are conducting the fishing are often companies that are associated with certain countries, right? So I think it's you know, I don't have a clear answer to your question, but I think oftentimes one can make a link to, you know, which countries are the hosts for some of the enablers of these activities.
And I think one other distinction that I draw, and I don't know if it's legally an important one, is the distinction between, on the one hand, taking things out of the seas, right? So not preserving resources and putting things into them that are pollution. And I think in some ways we have a better handle on the second one, regulating pollutants, than we do on the first one. And because very often these are done by private actors flying the flag of a particular country, but, you know, turning a blind eye to what they're doing. So I think it is in some ways easier to police the affirmative pollution rather than taking resources out of the ocean. So whether or not we have to take a better look at those, I think that's where the question might lie.
And stepping a little bit over my role, in high seas, there's a right of states to extract the different products on fishes and whatever. But there are some restrictions. For instance, there are treaties on whaling and so on. The problem with attaching responsibility to particular states is often because there are convenience flags. What does that mean? That a ship which is perhaps owned by a person from the US that has workers from the US, well, I'm saying the US, but I could have said any other country, that has workers from the US and so on, registers itself in Liberia and Panama. And actually, Liberia and Panama are two of the most largest states that have registered ships. And it's not because of their power, as you can imagine, it's because of the lenient laws that they have on working rights and so on. Sorry about that. And would anybody else like to ask another question? We have time for only one additional question. Yes?
So in terms of environmental justice, on the domestic level, when you can kind of hone in on local communities and go into them and kind of figure out their issues there, how does that kind of approach come in the international level with it being so widespread and kind of countries working together to take on these different issues? What does that look like as compared to domestic?
I think that what I mentioned earlier, and thank you for raising the international corporation side, I think that's very important. Working with local stakeholders is very crucial when you're doing work, you know, with multiple countries. So just ensuring that you're making correct partnerships, like kind of like, you know, the environmental justice in the domestic side, where you really have to, you know, engage people and engage with people that understand the reality of a certain situation that's essentially what you need to do when working with international issues of countries where you really don't know or understand or can't pretend to understand the realities that are happening. So engaging with those local stakeholders, but also like building trust as well is very important. So yeah, that's definitely very crucial.
And I guess I would put in a little bit of a plug or a little more optimism about regional cooperation, because I think on the one hand there is that role for national sovereignty. So each nation is looking at what laws and policies affect that country. Then there's the international multilateral agreements, but sometimes those can get so unwieldy because they only bind you if you consented to it. So we've seen that in the climate negotiations. But I think there's a real role for regional, because there it is extending beyond one particular country's borders. So, but yet at the same time, those countries that are geographically close to you, you also have some interest in making sure that pollution travels, and it will travel to your neighbors before it travels to anybody else. So I think giving some support for regional geographic regions, particularly those, again, that are economically developing and may not have the resources to have a strong regional cooperation. But I think that is something that we've thought about, the national and the international, and maybe regions get neglected more than they should be.
I thought it might be useful to just give an example. So I had mentioned this pipeline in Uganda. It's called the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. It's been controversial for a number of years. And we are working with lawyers in Uganda. We're working with communities in Uganda and Tanzania. And we're working with advocates in South Africa, France, all over Europe, Asia, the US, to address this issue. Why? Because the companies that are constructing this pipeline are Total from France. It is a Chinese company called Sinopec. The ones who are financing it is a Japanese bank, a South African bank, a Chinese bank, and then all these other kind of multinational banks are trying to finance it. And meanwhile, the Ugandan and Tanzanian governments are trying to push for it, while countries in the EU have said, "Hey, this is really going to be a violation of human rights, and we don't approve of this." So there's a lot of actors and voices involved, and but I think as Alicia said, the priority is the local voice, right? What do the local communities want? That's the starting point. And certainly, the government has tried to divide the communities, tried to bribe the communities to support the projects, but fundamentally, 90% of the communities oppose the projects. And so, we've supported the local advocates to take this to Ugandan courts, also to the East African Court of Justice, and the courts in France. And these are all ongoing. But I think I'll end by saying that this is there are similarities with EJ issues in the domestic sphere, in terms of having to the importance of prioritizing what do the affected communities want. But you get all these other kind of dimensions, right? All these actors that come from all around the world. I love being able to cooperate with people from all corners of the planet, and to be united in the fact that this is not only affecting the community, this is affecting all of us. But it does require a lot of coordination. It requires a lot of cultural sensitivity as well, and patience, and listening to not only the community but to each other, and really trying to find common ground. But I find it extremely rewarding.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting panel. I remind you that you have Google. There you will probably find their emails. And thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers, keynote, and both panels today. Thank you so much. We'd like to take a few final minutes to give you a little bit more information if you're feeling excited about what you heard today. I wanted to invite one of our staff editors and also the president of the Environmental Law Society here at the Law School, Grace Best, to talk for a couple minutes about her experience with the Environmental Law Society and ways that you can get involved and get this topic incorporated into your law school career. Also, by the way, before I forget, big thank you to Joe Ferraro. He's been taking photos today. He's helped us set up all the programs and all the graphics that you see. So I wanted to thank you before the day was over. Come on up, Grace.
Hi everybody, my name is Grace Best, as Kate said, I'm the president of the Environmental Law Society. I was lucky enough, one out fall last year, to bring the club back with a few other students. Mostly with the goal of just supporting and promoting students who were interested in environmental law. And we've been lucky to be able to do that with having outside speakers come in and talk to us and educate us. But Elissa was kind of reminding me here when she was talking about her international human rights law class, that it's so important to be educated and have opportunity to take classes. Like we have Professor Dunn's environmental justice course here and Professor Brain's environmental law class. Just having those opportunities to be educated about environmental law really renew my excitement in it, and I know renew other students' excitement in it, and really help us kind of find our own path in environmental law, which is really awesome. So I wanted to thank Kate and Jenny today too and all the speakers today for coming and educating us on this really important topic. And I wanted to invite all the speakers too, if you're ever interested in coming to talk to the Environmental Law Society, we'd be more than happy to have you. If there's ever any way that we can give back to your organizations by volunteering or anything like that, I'd be more than happy to talk with you about that. So thank you. And any students interested in Environmental Law Society, please feel free to come talk to me about it. Thank you all so much.
All right, so thanks again to all of our speakers. We would love it if you would all be willing to join us in the atrium now. We're going to have a reception with some light bites and refreshments, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you so much for being here today.